How's everybody doing? This is Dual Credit U.S. History for Mr. Campbell's class, and we now move into Chapter 9, the Confederation and the Constitution. So obviously we are transitioning from the Revolutionary War and now into that period of, well, what do we do now that we have gotten our freedom? There's sort of a weird dynamic going on here. First of all, there's a lot of sort of exterior factors that really could be called interior factors because they're actually here in the United States. A lot of your Tories have left the colonies, and those Tories, you'll remember, are those old hardliners from the British government, who were very loyal to the king. Well, with them leaving, that gives you a group of people that are sort of, it says they're inclined to experimentation. And so you've got for the time, a radical group of people that is willing to sort of try new things. Now, while you have that on the one hand with political systems, the economy also is going to stumble in the post-revolution days. And part of the reason is that we don't have one nation. We have 13 sovereign states. They're similar in political structure. And they have some fantastic political leaders, but at the end of the day, they're not one nation. They're 13 states that are sort of independent now, and can act on their own free will and accord. There's nothing to sort of bind them. Now, there's a Constitutional Congress called in 1776, so this is still going on during the Revolution, and basically, it asks each colony to draft constitutions for their state. So there are some basic requirements. One, the sovereignty. Sovereignty, that's a word that I've already used a couple times. Sovereignty just means the ability to rule. A sovereign is a ruler. The sovereignty of these new states, the centers of power have to rest on the authority of the people. Some states went terribly radical and wrote completely new state constitutions. Other states like Connecticut and Rhode Island, you'll find that Rhode Island is always going to be the one to sort of mess things up as we move forward. They just kind of looked at their colonial charter and made just a few slight changes to them. And so already you can see, long before the war is even over, there's already quite a bit of difference in the way that each state is going to approach this newfound freedom that they're sort of counting on, even back in 1776. Now, Massachusetts calls for a special convention, submits their final draft to every citizen that is of voting age and requirement, of course. And once the Constitution is adopted, the only way that you can change it is to have another constitutional convention. And it remains one of the longest living constitutions in the world. It's still the Constitution that Massachusetts lives under. It's their state constitution, and that's sort of a model that we're going to look at moving forward in terms of being able to make changes to it and reasons that is such a long-standing constitution. Sorry, my computer's... There we go. Some of the common features, among all of them, is because they're written documents, they are sort of, fundamental law, rather than just, random arbitrary law making. They recognize sort of a core set of fundamental laws. Most of them are going to have a Bill of Rights. Most are going to require, some type of annual or yearly election of legislatures, and all of them basically create a super weak executive and judicial branch. Now, the reason for that last point is is pretty obvious. When you think about it, these states have just come from a system by which they were directly ruled by a king who they viewed as tyrannical. And so that central authority is something that the colonists would view as dangerous. And so creating an executive that was powerful was something that was to be feared. And if you think about it in that context, it makes a lot of sense that they would create a weak executive, a judicial branch, that was used to punish them, and again became just a tyrannical arm of that tyrannical executive. It would make sense that they would make the judicial branch weaker. The third piece of any legitimate government, that is sort of the lawmaking body. I should say any legitimate constitutional government. That legislative is a representative body, and that's the one that they're going to give all the power to because they feel like they have some level of control. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, obviously, things have changed over time. The executive has become much, much more powerful, as has the judicial, but not nearly as powerful for my money as and for many people's money as the executive. But we'll talk about that later. Again, the biggest thing to point out is that in all of these constitutions, the sort of democratic character of them shows you just how sort of fed up people, not just here in the colonies, but really people in the West, even in Western Europe, places like Britain, places like France, how sort of fed up they were with sort of the tyrannical elitism of monarchy. And one of the simplest ways that you can see this is just to look at how some states are going to move their capitals from the coast. They're going to move them into the interior of their colonies, which is where, sort of patterns of migration over time that we've talked about, people are sort of getting tired of living in these crowded, cramped cities, and they're wanting to move west. So that sort of demonstrates that there is a change in power going on. And that's something that we don't think about a lot of times. We don't think about geography as an indication of power, but really it kind of is here. Now, not all colonies are going to move their capitals. For example, Massachusetts is going to keep their capital in Boston, but many states do. So, economic changes. There's a lot of stuff going on, not just politically, but also economically. So, former lands that are controlled by the crown, states now have control of those. Land is going to become very, very cheap. It's going to become very, very easy to claim in a very quick period of time. Economic democracy preceding political democracy. Basically what that means is we are more what is called laissez-faire, historically speaking, than any other country in the world, mainly because when we throw off the chains of rule by Britain, it's every man for himself, economically speaking. And so, not only is it an economic democracy, it's really kind of an economic meritocracy, basically survival of the fittest, economically speaking. Now, one of the positive side effects of the revolution is that, you can't really trade with Britain. Britain, for a long period of time, had a very effective blockade on the colonies. So in order to get, weapons, in order to get clothes, in order to get ammunition, all those things that you need to fight a war, the colonies had to begin their own manufacturing. So that is something that also is going to be a change now, is prior to the revolution, we are almost exclusively a agricultural economy. Now we're going to see a little bit of manufacturing take effect. Some of the drawbacks of economic independence is that a lot of your commerce, in terms of from Britain, was reserved for sort of the loyal parts of the empire. So your northern commerce was used to sort of, going out and venturing out because they were a little bit more independent minded. But in the South especially, there are very strong British ties. So you have some colonies that still trade with Britain. You have some colonies that refuse to. American ships are now barred from British and British West India harbors. So again, your southern colonies, their trade is kind of stifled in the beginning because they really don't have many other options because the only people that they've traded with were the British. Fisheries are going to be disrupted up in the north because, again, of fishing lanes and things like that. American colonies can now freely trade with other nations, and that does bring some benefits in terms of new places to trade your goods, such as China, for example. So we began trading with China even very early on in our sort of political lives, and you'll hear my children in the background a little bit, and that's okay. They understand about as much of this as sometimes I do. War is also going to bring about speculation and profiteering. So speculation is basically, this is most common with land during this time period, where an individual will buy a tract of land in hopes that the value of that land will go up. So you buy it for a very, very low price. And then typically out west, you'll buy lands that are west of the Allegheny Mountain Range. And then you will hope that as people begin to move west, that those land values will go up. State governments are going to get into some trouble because they're going to borrow more money than they can repay. And because of that, inflation ruins a lot of people. And the average citizen at the beginning of sort of our new nation is really off to a bad start and is actually worse off than they were under British rule than they are now under this new independent rule. On the whole, economically and socially, everything is sort of off kilter. You have a newer rich class and other people who now become destitute. So there are some people that sort of the social order becomes flipped. And there's also things that you have to deal with in terms of things that had sort of brought the revolution about. Nobody really likes taxes, even though taxes are kind of necessary for running a country. And there's generally just a disrespect for law in general, which is also something that the colonies are going to have to overcome. I think we're going to stop there with a lot of the problems that we faced before we get into the creating of the Confederate, of the Articles of Confederation. So that's where we'll pick up in section 2 is with the Articles of Confederation, and we'll see you there.